all the Australians celebrating our successes of the Matildas last night. I'm right there with you. It was a fantastic game and a great way to start off what is going to be an amazing Women's World Cup, with the viewership expected to be in the billions, not the millions. So today we have an absolutely amazing topic, and one I know that you've asked a lot of questions around because you wonder what data is, why is it important, etc. So I have a special guest. My partner in crime and colleague Andrew is going to be joining me in regards to some of these questions, and we'll go through some of these minutiae details for you. Welcome, Andrew.
G'day, Kako.
Now, one of the big questions we get asked, and it's probably something in regards to the recent APRA findings around what organisations are doing and protecting their data. But let's take this step back because we have a lot of questions. So data is in various and different forms, but why is it a critical asset to an organisation?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of talk about data over the last couple of years. It's kind of become a bit of a buzzword, but it's nothing new to business. I mean, businesses have been collecting data for years and years and years. I guess all that's happened recently is the volume of data that has been coming at us and the velocity at which it's been coming at us has increased significantly. I think also too, an awareness around that data has increased too. And so I think now organisations are able to access that data in a way that makes it far more accessible, far more usable. If you think about data, even back 10 years ago, and still in some industries, that data is locked up on pieces of paper. It might be put in a cupboard or in a filing system somewhere. Now, with digitisation kind of complete, I guess you'd say, from digital transformation type projects, the opportunity to rethink that data and to really dig into it and harness it is presented to customers, and not just in a linear type way. And what I mean by that is, being able to step through different processes to use the data for, but also in a more abstract sort of thinking way as well, being able to apply sort of machine learning models and artificial intelligence training by using the data down that path. So, there are some more buzzwords and I guess more direction where the industry will go in the next little while. But remembering, of course, that you can't train models or do the AI pieces without some historical, some data on which to train those models from. So, that's the importance of data, sort of past, present, and future.
It's an interesting point you make there. I mean, we talked about democratization of data in one of the lives a while back. And that's that concept of decoupling data, because it's obviously heavily isolated, especially when we're talking about platforms or software. Models of change have come in a vast and rapid ways, as you stated, right? I mean, if you consider the last 2 years of data has exploded, and it has doubled the amount of data that the internet has stored compared to what it did 10 years ago, 2 years ago, even as an example. But the criticality of that means that the cloud used to be the most important, the infrastructure part used to be the most important part of an organization to support its operations. Then it moved into software, which we've started to see software as a service. That's really blossomed and bloomed. Things like Office 365 for Microsoft, Gmail, for example, and Google. But now we're talking about extending that out to other platforms like ERPs, for example, CRMs. Now, what that then creates is silos of data. So how do we extricate that to give it some real possible value so that the organizations can do exactly what you were talking about there, get value from their data?
Yeah, data has a gravity to it. And this is not a new concept. The hyperscalers, the AWSs, your Azure, Googles all recognize this fairly early on and have recognized that where the data goes, so to the supporting services and therefore the revenues as well. So, people, I think, people and organizations have probably given up some of that data, not necessarily in terms of allowing people to use it, but certainly in terms of not giving as much consideration to where it should be placed as perhaps they should have. And so there is situations around where data has ended up in these silos that you talk about, whether that's a particular SaaS or PaaS platform on a particular cloud provider, and it makes it particularly cost inhibitive or even innovatively awkward to bring the data out and really leverage the full value from it. So I think again, it's something that people are becoming more aware of where their data is, recognizing the data as an asset, like other assets that might exist on the company's balance sheet, and then really treating it in such a way. So, treating in the way that there's consideration as to what the return on assets might be. How can we leverage value to improve operational performance of companies? Whether that's by driving new product lines, whether it's by helping to reduce costs. But again, it can only be done where data can be accessed. And so I think now there's I guess, a bit of a turning point. This has probably been a spotlight has been shot on this sort of area in the last 18 months since some corrections in terms of financial markets and focus on company performance, and where there's had to be a sort of a tightening, I guess, or a streamlining of organisations and their operational models. There's a consideration given to how do we most effectively keep this data, how do we maintain it, how do we protect it, and the answer isn't necessarily always just to hand it off to a third party and outsource it, or put it in a location where we didn't really have to consider cost before. So we're seeing more and more of that. I think like I said before, the data gravity is a key driver with the other services that follow it. But we're seeing customers now considering more and more who their partners are as well in terms of managing these data sets. We want to make sure that if the data exists and the data is the asset, how do we give the best possible chance of getting a return on that asset? So, making sure it's accessible, making sure that we aren't just stuck on one particular technology vendor's roadmap. We want to make sure that data can be used in the innovative approaches that businesses are coming up with. And that's really the cornerstone of digital transformation. That's a term that's been thrown around a lot. And we see in projects, certainly ASC, where we engage with customers and partners, perhaps they have headed off down a path of a digital transformation following a shiny light of, say, an AI, ML, or other type activity, haven't got the data in order. So it's sometimes a little bit boring and sometimes a little bit dull, but it is necessary to get that kind of housekeeping done and the hygiene in place, so that the other more innovative and more value-adding activities can actually take place. Because there's nothing worse than kind of building a house on a foundation of sand, if you like. It'll eventually crumble.
It's an interesting point you make there around sand. So let's talk about a journey. We've talked about data, obviously, what it is, how it values an organisation. It's critical to its mass. How the evolution of data has obviously came to a point where it's now being able to be democratized, removed, and decoupled from an application. So the next level would be to then pull that into, let's call it a value-added source. So you can talk about it from a generic model of, say, a data warehouse. I would prefer probably not, because that's obviously an industry term, but let's just use that as a reference point. At that point, the traditional model would be to remove only certain potential values of data, as you've spoken about, when you put it into, say, a cloud or a sort of staggered approach to database. That then means that you have added cost, etc. So what's the value of being able to extricate all of the data versus the traditional, ETL, to enable someone to enrich that data in the future and ask future questions from it?
Yeah, so the ETL approach has been around for a long time, and has basically involved extracting data from sources and transforming it to making a decision on that point in time, what you're keeping, and then loading it into, like you said, something with data warehouse. It's often been a quite prudent activity in terms of culling data that we think may not be important. But when we flip that around and we look at an approach of, say, ELT, so extract, load, and transform, we basically extract everything, we load everything, and then we transform later. And so people might say that's wasteful or it's costly. I think it depends on the way in which you do that. And so we certainly have an approach where we leverage, the power and the scale of the cloud, for example, object storage, to do that type of stuff. But it means that we can keep the asset, we can have it preserved for future posterity, but then also if and when a business problem arises that we're trying to solve for. And effectively, that's what this data analysis is. It's having a hypothesis and then proving it with data. The more data you have, the more sure you can be about your result. And so that's why we say by being able to sort of decouple and leverage data into a repository that still remains accessible in a cost-effective way, this is really the future in terms of making sure that our data-driven decisions and our forecasting, modeling, and other activities that we're doing with the data can become more and more accurate, based on having more and more data being available. So, we include in that obviously the structured data that comes out of your systems that you've mentioned, like ERPs and CRMs. But we also talk about the unstructured data and things like video and machine data and other pieces. It's a growing area. All have value, some way, shape, or form, but only has value if you have it. So, like any asset, it's about managing the asset, protecting the asset, and leveraging the asset to your advantage.
And let's just take the curly question here around the asset being data. And obviously, there's a key element of privacy when we talk about data. Now, we're talking about regulation, we're talking about governance. We hear it a lot at the board level, we hear it a lot, at the senior management level. How do we then get some, visibility around how this data is and where it lives, etc., for giving that clarity on what it is that we're doing with it?
Yeah, I think the short answer is we can't.
It's an interesting dichotomy, isn't it?
The long answer is machines can. So I think, again, back to the sort of velocity and volume of data that's happening, it's now impossible for the human mind and even groups of human minds to fathom the amount of data that's being generated. So we have to turn to assisted tools that allow us to, take in all these different data components and then do something functional with it. The classic that we see out there is presenting dashboards of data or visualizations of data, and sort of calling that data science. Well, it's not even skimming the surface in terms of what really is capable, what's possible. They're great activities and certainly summation of what you might have, but in terms of actually driving real usable outcomes and insights, that's a whole other level that just needs another level of assistance. And I think probably only really now, with the clouds at the scale that they are and continuing to grow. Again, I guess also the openness of various machine learning and AI algorithms as well. We can start harnessing some of these. So it's certainly a frontier, and we're at the beginning of I guess a burst of breakthrough there. But again, none of this is possible unless the data is well organized and readily accessible.
Yeah, and look, and that takes me back to that whole concept of having a data strategy first, right? And the concept of being able to use an organizational data strategy to outline what a digital transformation program that you've mentioned, for example, or any sort of program of works, especially when we're talking about changes in an organization. So
Yeah.
the concept of digital platforms movement. So we are seeing a lot of movements. People are trying to get economies of scale, so moving from legacy platforms to cloud-based, or for example, having to move into a platform that gives them a higher percentage of usable functionality. The 80-20 rule, we understand some people have a platform that can do a certain percentage of work, but then moving into that. So by democratizing this data, does that liberate them and give them a better opportunity to move?
Well, I think it gives you choices, right? And I think it's like the old saying, the more options you have, um, the more choices you can make. So I think the reality is that by making the data open and accessible, you present the opportunity to do more and innovative things, leveraging different ideas and concepts in a diverse type environment. I guess the flip side of that is the more open you make it, the more susceptible you make it to misuse as well. So, and that's a key point, is that you have the asset, you need to protect the asset. It's not dissimilar to, you own a building, you need to make sure you lock the building. You need to make sure that you have security if that's necessary, and all those sort of things that go with that. You need to do the maintenance on the building. one of our team had a really good point recently in terms of a customer in a professional services type industry who holds um, data for thousands and thousands of end customers. And we have many customers in that sort of scenario and that sort of boat, is that they're effectively a honeypot for misuse of data. If you
Mm.
think about the attacks and the cyber incidents that have occurred recently, Optus, Medibank are two sort of high-profile ones and well-known ones. People are going after data, and so that data is really what needs to be protected. Yes, you can cause inconvenience and operational impact if you disrupted the system, but it seems to be that the greater use or the greater misuse use case is taking data and then doing something with that, whether it's recreating someone's identity and using it for deception or something or other else. That's really where we see the flip side of having a large amount of data. It needs to be protected, just like any asset does.
Yeah, no, valid points, and thanks for sharing those, Andrew. Really appreciate it. I know that's answered a number of our questions that have been asked around data this week. I will get to a few more around the security behind that, the governance, risk, and compliance. If you are interested in one of those, please go and see the one that I did with Benji about 2 months ago. So thank you for your questions on that. By all means, Andrew, any final thoughts or any insights you want to share with everyone?
No, I think just a slogan that we've coined here, which is basically every business is a data business, and if you're not a data business, then you're not in business. So
Love
just
it.
need to think about your data and do the very best with it that you can.
Thank you for your insights, mate. Really appreciate it, guys. As always, appreciate you joining me. Ask any questions you want. Andrew and I will be answering those. Andrew is also linked in the title at the top. Feel free to connect with him, ask any questions you have. Go the Matildas. I will be certainly following the World Cup this weekend. So please, by all means, comment below who you think is going to win this year. But until we all speak next week, be safe out there. Think before you click and have a fantastic weekend.